As autumn turned to winter in 1944, the relentless push across France began to yield fruit. Major ports like Antwerp were liberated, and the shattered railway networks, painstakingly repaired by engineering units, slowly began to hum back to life. The Red Ball Express, having served its critical purpose in sustaining the rapid advance, gradually began to wind down its intense round-the-clock operations. The necessity that had birthed it was fading, replaced by more conventional, albeit still challenging, logistical channels. But the legacy of the Red Ball Express, and of the vehicles that made its impossible mission possible, would endure. Elias Thorne's worthless truck, the Thorne Hauler, had proven its worth beyond any doubt. It had been the workhorse that refused to quit, the tireless beast that clawed its way through mud, over rubble, and across flooded fields, delivering the vital supplies that kept the Allied war machine advancing. It had not been elegant, nor particularly fast, but it had been dependable, easily repairable, and utterly unstoppable when it mattered most. Elias, ever the man of quiet dedication, returned to Detroit as the war in Europe drew to a close. He received no medals, no grand parades. His name was not emblazoned on the side of every Thorne Hauler, though the men who drove them knew its lineage. Major Thompson, now promoted to colonel, did write a commendation, buried deep within the military archives, praising Thorne's unconventional foresight and unparalleled mechanical ingenuity. For Elias, the true reward lay in the silent knowledge that his design had made a difference. He carried the images of the mud-caked drivers, the exhausted mechanics, and the relieved faces of soldiers receiving their rations or ammunition. He knew his trucks had played a part in easing their burdens, in keeping them alive, in pushing back the tide of tyranny. The Thorne Haulers, many of them scarred by shrapnel and countless miles of brutal service, continued to operate for months after VE Day, aiding in the monumental task of reconstruction and repatriation. Some were eventually sold off as surplus, finding new lives as logging trucks in the Pacific Northwest or heavy-duty farm vehicles in the American heartland. Their rugged construction perfectly suited for civilian tasks that demanded similar endurance. Their design principles: high ground clearance, robust suspension, simplified maintenance, and powerful, low-speed torque would subtly influence post-war heavy vehicle manufacturing. Though often without direct attribution to Elias Thorne, Elias himself quietly rejoined the civilian automotive industry, continuing to design and innovate, though perhaps with a newfound wisdom. He understood that true innovation was not always about flashy speed or sleek aesthetics, but about practical utility, about solving real-world problems with robust, enduring solutions. He saw that the most valuable designs were often those that were initially dismissed, those that challenged conventional thinking, those that were built to withstand the harshest realities. The Red Ball Express, and the story of the Thorne Hauler, stands as a testament to the unseen heroes of World War II, not just the drivers and mechanics who risked their lives daily, but also the engineers and designers whose ingenuity, often overlooked, provided the very backbone of the war effort. It is a story of human resilience, mechanical endurance, and the triumph of a worthless idea that became an indispensable lifeline. It reminds us that sometimes the most profound impact comes not from the loudest voices or the most glittering innovations, but from the quiet, persistent vision of a man who simply understood what was truly needed and built it to last. As the Allied forces pushed relentlessly deeper into France, the logistical nightmare intensified. The front line stretched further and further from the established ports, and the demands for fuel, ammunition, and rations grew exponentially. The Red Ball Express, once a desperate improvisation, had become the beating heart of the advance. Without it, the entire offensive would grind to a halt. And within the Red Ball, Elias Thorne's once mock design was no longer a whispered rumor, but a roaring, undeniable success, Reports filtered back through the command chain. Thorn haulers were consistently making deliveries where other trucks failed. They were navigating routes deemed impassable, their powerful engines and high-clearance chassis shrugging off mud, debris, and even shallow streams. The initial skepticism of the quartermaster corps had given way to a grudging admiration, then to an urgent demand. Orders for the Thorn hauler, initially a trickle, became a flood. Production, once a side note, was ramped up, and existing standard trucks were sometimes retrofitted with Thorn-inspired modifications, stronger axles, higher suspensions, and those distinctive, aggressive tires. Elias, still a quiet presence, found himself more frequently summoned to high-level briefings, his grease-stained hands now pointing to maps, his soft voice explaining the nuances of terrain and traction. He spoke not of strategy, but of mud, of torque, of the exact angle a wheel needed to climb out of a bomb crater. He remained grounded, however, spending most of his time at the forward depots, watching, learning, and refining. He witnessed the human cost of the Red Ball Express, the hollow eyes of drivers who hadn't slept in days, the constant tension of traversing roads under threat of ambush, the sheer, back-breaking labor of loading and unloading. One particularly harrowing week saw the Thorn haulers truly earn their stripes. General Patton's Third Army, spearheading the advance towards the Moselle River, found itself critically short of fuel. A sudden torrential rainstorm had turned every road and field into a swamp, and a key bridge had been destroyed by retreating German forces. Conventional trucks were hopelessly mired, their convoys stalled for miles. The situation was dire. Tanks were literally running on fumes, and the offensive threatened to collapse. In a desperate gamble, a route was identified through a dense, waterlogged forest, a path considered utterly impassable for wheeled vehicles. Only the Thorn haulers were deemed capable of attempting it. A convoy of 50 Thorn haulers, laden with barrels of aviation fuel and jerrycans of gasoline, began their perilous journey. The drivers, many of whom had already endured days without proper rest, pushed themselves to their limits. They drove through the night, the powerful headlights of the Thorn haulers cutting through the driving rain, illuminating a path of churning mud and fallen trees. The trucks bucked and groaned, their engines roaring, but they kept moving. The articulated suspension worked tirelessly, allowing the wheels to find purchase on uneven ground, pulling the heavy loads through seemingly insurmountable obstacles. At one point, a Thorn hauler, driven by a young African-American soldier named Private Johnson, got stuck in a particularly deep axle-snapping rut. Instead of giving up, Johnson, with the help of his co-driver, used the truck's powerful winch, designed by Elias for self-recovery, to pull the vehicle free, its massive tires slowly churning until it found solid ground again. This wasn't merely a mechanical feat. It was a testament to the resilience of both man and machine. When the convoy finally emerged from the forest, hours behind schedule but with their precious cargo largely intact, the sight was met with cheers from the waiting tank crews. Patton himself, a man not easily impressed by logistical feats, reportedly gave a rare, approving nod. The fuel arrived just in time, allowing the Third Army to resume its offensive, punching through German lines and securing critical ground. The worthless truck, the brick on wheels, had in that moment become the spearhead of the Allied advance. Elias, observing from a distance, felt a complex mix of pride and sorrow. His invention, born of a simple desire for robust utility, was now enabling the brutal machinery of war. Yet he also saw the faces of the weary drivers, the gratitude in the eyes of the soldiers receiving their supplies, and he knew his design was serving a vital, undeniable purpose. It was not about glory or recognition for himself. It was about the unseen heroes, the men who drove through mud and danger, and the machines that carried them, keeping the front alive. The Thorn hauler was no longer just a truck. It was a symbol of endurance, a lifeline forged in the unforgiving fire of war. The Red Ball Express, a relentless river of steel and gasoline, stretched for hundreds of miles across the liberated French countryside. From the supply dumps at Cherbourg and Omaha Beach, through the battered towns and shattered villages, to the ever-shifting front lines, the convoys ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It was a logistical marvel born of sheer necessity and human grit. But it was also a brutalizing ordeal. Drivers, often young men barely out of their teens, battled fatigue, German snipers, and the constant threat of mechanical failure. The roads, if they could even be called that, were a testament to war's destructive power, cratered by bombs, churned into a fine dust in dry weather, and transformed into an impassable, glutinous mud after every rainfall. Initially, the thorn haulers were a mere whisper in the roar of the Red Ball, a few dozen among thousands of standard trucks. Their drivers, a mix of volunteers and those assigned due to their unorthodox driving skills, were still learning the quirks of Elias's design. But slowly, steadily, their reputation began to grow. Word of mouth, the most powerful currency in the field, started to spread. Did you hear about those new high boys? Heard one pulled a bogged-down Sherman out of a ditch last night. Saw a thorn hauler go right through that flooded stretch near Verdun. Didn't even slow down. Sergeant Miller, a veteran driver with a perpetually weary face, had initially scoffed at the Thorn's folly. His deuce and a half had been his trusted companion through North Africa, and he saw no reason to switch. But after his truck had broken down for the third time in as many days, its differential housing cracked by a particularly nasty rut, he found himself assigned to a Thorn hauler. His first impression was that it felt like driving a small house. The cabin was utilitarian, the controls robust, almost agricultural. But the moment he put it in gear and felt the massive tires bite into the soft earth, a flicker of understanding ignited. The Thorn hauler didn't glide. It clawed its way forward. It didn't fear the ruts. It shrugged them off. Its high axle seemed to float above the deepest depressions, and its powerful engine, designed for consistent torque, pulled its heavy load of ammunition with an almost insolent ease. Miller soon became a convert. He saw firsthand how the Thorn hauler could navigate stretches of road that had been declared impassable for other vehicles. He learned that while it wasn't fast, it was reliable. And reliability, in the brutal calculus of the Red Ball Express, was paramount. A truck that could consistently deliver its cargo, even if slower, was infinitely more valuable than a faster one that spent half its time mired in mud or awaiting repairs. The mechanics, too, started to appreciate Elias's foresight. The simplified engine access, the robust modular components, and the clear, logical layout meant that many repairs that would have taken hours on a standard truck could be accomplished in the field with basic tools. A broken leaf spring on a deuce and a half could mean a day-long recovery operation. On a Thorn hauler with its articulated suspension, a damaged component could often be temporarily braced or even bypassed, allowing the truck to limp to the next repair station, its cargo still intact. This ease of maintenance meant less downtime, fewer recovery missions, and more supplies reaching the front. Elias Thorn himself, having secured permission to observe his designs in action, was often found at the forward repair depots. He wasn't a decorated officer, just a civilian mechanic in a dusty uniform, but the men recognized the quiet authority in his eyes. He listened intently to their feedback, scribbling notes on grease-stained pads, sometimes making immediate, crude modifications to a prototype with his own hands. He saw the toll the war took on them, the sleepless nights, the constant danger, the sheer physical exhaustion. He saw the mud, the chaos, the desperate improvisations. And he saw his worthless design, initially dismissed with a chuckle, now becoming a silent, stoic hero of the logistical war, One particularly harrowing night, a thorn hauler, driven by a young private named Jenkins, was part of a convoy carrying urgently needed blood plasma and medical supplies. A sudden German artillery barrage scattered the convoy, leaving Jenkins's truck stranded on a narrow, heavily cratered path. The other vehicles, lighter and less robust, had either veered off into ditches or suffered direct hits. Jenkins, alone and terrified, found his way forward blocked by a fresh, deep crater. He contemplated abandoning the truck, but the thought of the vital cargo spurred him on. Remembering the training he'd received on the thorn hauler's capabilities, he engaged the low-range gear, locked the differentials, and slowly, painstakingly, coaxed the truck forward. The massive tires gripped the crumbling edges of the crater. The high chassis cleared the bottom, and with a grunt of its powerful engine, the thorn hauler climbed out, carrying its precious cargo to safety. Jenkins arrived at the field hospital hours later, mud-caked and shaking, but the plasma was delivered. That night, the worthless truck had saved lives. The Red Ball Express, a lifeline forged in desperation, was slowly but surely recognizing its new indispensable vessel. The summer of 1944 was a relentless grind. Allied forces, having breached Fortress Europe, found themselves pushing eastward across a landscape that seemed to conspire against them. Normandy's hedgerows, once a tactical advantage for the defenders, now became a claustrophobic maze for advancing tanks and infantry. Beyond that, the open fields, churned by endless convoys and summer rains, quickly dissolved into treacherous bogs. The existing supply trucks, General Motors CCKW 2.5-ton Deuce and a half, and its peers, though reliable in their intended roles, were simply not built for the extraordinary demands being placed upon them. Their axles snapped, their tires spun uselessly in the thick, viscous mud, and their relatively low ground clearance meant they frequently bellied out, becoming immobile obstacles. Miles of critical supplies lay marooned on beaches and in depots, while at the front, soldiers fought with dwindling ammunition and tanks ran dry of petrol. The advance was slowing, threatening to stall completely. It was in this crucible of desperation that the idea of the Red Ball Express was born. A dedicated, one-way loop of trucks, running day and night from the ports of Normandy to the rapidly expanding front lines. A logistical artery pulsating with the lifeblood of the Allied war machine. But an artery, no matter how vital, is only as strong as its vessels. And the existing vessels were failing. Meanwhile, back in the States, Elias Thorn had continued his quiet advocacy. He'd sent letters, unsolicited blueprints, and even a crudely built scale model of his design to various military procurement offices, often receiving polite but firm rejections. Yet, one of his letters, penned with an urgency born of the unfolding crisis, landed on the desk of a Major Thompson, an unassuming logistics officer buried deep within the quartermaster corps. Thompson, unlike Sterling, had served in the field during the North African campaign. He'd seen the mud, felt the frustration of stalled convoys, and possessed an open mind born of necessity. Thorn's descriptions of high axle clearance, a simplified but robust drivetrain, and easily replaceable components resonated with Thompson's own experiences against considerable internal resistance. Thompson managed to secure a small allocation for Elias, not for full production, but for a trial. The factory, under pressure to meet existing quotas, begrudgingly allowed Thorn a small corner of a workshop and a skeleton crew. They were given a handful of existing chassis, and Elias, with a fierce, renewed energy, began to adapt them, incorporating the core principles of his worthless design. He oversaw the fitting of custom-fabricated, heavy-duty axles that lifted the chassis several feet higher than standard trucks. He designed a simplified, all-wheel drive system that was less prone to seizing up in dirt and water. The leaf springs were replaced with a more robust, articulated suspension that allowed for extreme wheel travel, ensuring all 4 or 6 On some prototypes, wheels maintained contact with the ground even over deeply rutted terrain. Most significantly, he sourced massive, specially reinforced tires with an aggressive lug pattern, designed to chew through mud and gravel like a monstrous boot. The first prototypes, dubbed the Thorn Hauler by the men who grudgingly worked on them, were undeniably ugly. They looked like a cross between a farm tractor and a military transport, all raw power and no finesse. When the first few dozen were finally shipped to France, arriving in the chaotic staging areas behind the Red Ball Express routes, they were met with a mixture of bewilderment and outright derision. "What in blazes is that?" a grizzled sergeant of the Transportation Corps exclaimed, staring at a Thorn Hauler as it rumbled off a landing craft, its tall silhouette incongruous next to the familiar deuce and a halves. "Looks like a giant spider," another quipped. Drivers, accustomed to the conventional controls and feel of their standard trucks, were initially hesitant. The Thorn Hauler felt different. Heavier, more ponderous in its steering, but possessed a strange, almost unstoppable momentum once it got going. Major Thompson, who had personally traveled to oversee the trial, faced the skepticism head-on. "Men, these are not parade vehicles. These are for the mud, for the broken roads, for when every other truck bogs down. Give them a chance. Take them where the others fear to tread." The first proving ground was a particularly notorious stretch of road outside St. Louis, a perpetually churned-up artery that had swallowed countless standard trucks. Rain had turned the already soft earth into a knee-deep quagmire. A convoy of deuce and a halves was already stuck, their wheels spinning hopelessly, engines roaring in frustration. Into this morass drove a small column of Thorn Haulers, their drivers, initially wary, now grimly determined. Slowly, deliberately, the tall, ungainly trucks began to move. Their massive tires bit into the mud, finding purchase where others slipped. The articulated suspension allowed them to crawl over deep ruts and obstacles that would have instantly high-centered a conventional vehicle. One by one, they navigated the treacherous stretch, their engines maintaining a steady, powerful thrum. A quiet murmur spread among the stranded drivers and mechanics. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't fast, but it was moving. It was delivering the goods. And in the mud-soaked, desperate reality of the Red Ball Express, that was all that mattered. In the simmering heat of a late spring day in 1940, long before the thunder of Normandy's guns echoed across the channel, Elias Thorne hunched over a drafting table in a dimly lit corner of a Detroit automotive plant. The air was thick with the scent of oil, metal, and the faint, sweet promise of wartime production. A promise Elias felt keenly but interpreted differently than his peers. While others sketched sleek military sedans or faster, more agile jeeps, Elias's hand moved with deliberate, almost stubborn strokes, bringing to life a machine that looked less like a vehicle of war and more like a monstrous, functional beast of burden. His design, meticulously detailed across several large sheets, was an affront to conventional wisdom. It was tall, ungainly, with an exaggerated ground clearance that made it look as though it had been built on stilts. Its wheels were massive, almost comically so, shod with tires whose aggressive treads promised purchase on any surface short of a vertical cliff. The engine, though robust, was designed for torque and endurance, not speed, and its chassis was a labyrinth of reinforced steel, seemingly over-engineered for strength, yet simplified for field maintenance. Elias, a man whose hands were permanently stained with grease, and whose spectacles often slid down his nose, possessed a mind that saw beyond the immediate horizon. He'd spent his youth wrestling with broken-down farm machinery on his uncle's windswept Michigan acreage, learning the brutal lessons of mud, ice, and unforgiving loads. He understood that a machine in a field, hundreds of miles from a proper workshop, needed to be a friend, not a finicky mistress. It needed to be fixable with a wrench and a prayer, not a specialized diagnostic tool his current employer a well-established automotive firm now transitioning rapidly to military contracts, saw little value in Thorne's eccentric vision. "Thorne, what is this contraption?" General Manager Robert Sterling had asked, his voice laced with patronizing amusement, as he'd once stopped by Elias's station. Sterling, a man of polished shoes and even more polished rhetoric, preferred designs that looked impressive on parade grounds, not slogging through hypothetical quagmires. "It's a heavy-duty transport, sir," Elias had replied, his voice a low rumble, devoid of the usual deference. "Designed for extreme terrain, minimal maintenance, and maximum load bearing. It's for conditions where roads cease to exist." Sterling had chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. "Roads cease to exist. Thorne, this war will be fought on paved highways and established routes. We need speed, not a glorified tractor." He'd tapped a manicured finger on Elias's drawings. "Look at this suspension, overcomplicated. And the engine access? It's crude. This isn't a precision instrument, Thorne. It's a brick on wheels. Frankly, it's worthless. Focus on the standard light truck designs, please. We have quotas to meet." Elias had merely nodded, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He knew his design was not for parade grounds. It was for the inevitable chaos, the unforeseen hardships of a war that would chew up conventional logic and spit it out. He saw the future in the endless European mud, in the bombed-out bridges and cratered roads, in the desperate need to keep men and machines fed and armed, no matter the cost. He continued to tinker, refining his blueprints in his spare time, sometimes late into the night, fueled by lukewarm coffee and an unwavering conviction. He believed in the resilience of simple, robust mechanics, in the power of a machine built to endure, not to impress. As the war intensified, and America's entry became a certainty, the demand for military vehicles surged. Factories hummed with round-the-clock shifts. Elias found himself relegated to a minor role, overseeing the assembly line for standard cargo trucks, his own designs gathering dust in a forgotten drawer. Yet, he watched the newsreels with a growing sense of dread and vindication. The early campaigns in North Africa and Italy, though distant, offered glimpses of the reality he'd foreseen: vehicles mired in sand, struggling on rocky paths, their delicate components failing under the brutal conditions. He saw trucks overturning, their cargo spilled, their axles snapped. He felt a quiet ache, knowing he held a potential solution. Dismissed as an impractical dream, then came D-Day. June 6, 1944. The invasion of Normandy was a triumph of audacious planning and unparalleled bravery. But even as the beachheads were secured and the Allied forces pushed inland, a new, insidious enemy emerged: logistics. The rapid advance outstripped the ability to unload supplies from ships, consolidate them, and transport them to the front lines. Ports were bombed, railways shattered, and the narrow, winding French roads, never designed for such heavy, continuous traffic, quickly became choked with mud and debris. The conventional trucks, the very model Sterling had championed, began to falter. They sank into the soft earth, their engines overheated, their suspensions buckled under the strain. The initial optimism of the breakthrough threatened to drown in a sea of logistical despair. Supplies piled up on the beaches while men at the front, fighting for every inch, started to run low on ammunition, fuel, and food. The stage was set for an unprecedented logistical challenge, one that would demand more than speed or elegance. It would demand brute force, relentless endurance, and perhaps the resurrection of a worthless design.